The reading this morning comes from the 18th chapter of Luke's Gospel, beginning at verse 9 and continuing through verse 14. Jesus told this parable. He told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous, while they regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves and rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. For I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, said Jesus, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. Here ends the reading. It was horrible. Maybe the worst thing that's happened to me in a long, long time. Horrible and awfully embarrassing. I was in the grocery store last week. I didn't have a lot of things to pick up, but too many items for the express lane. As I pushed my cart toward the checkout area, I was discouraged, for all the lines were long. And I hate waiting. I made my way to the shortest line, line 5. But even that line had 3 other shoppers with their carts filled with groceries. I settled in and tried to practice my Buddha breathing, taking deep, calm, cleansing breaths. But then I noticed something. Line 2 only had 1 shopper in it. Now, lots of times, line 2 is an express lane, but the light wasn't on. Apparently no one realized it. Trying not to tip my hand, I casually pushed my cart that way and asked the cashier, is your light supposed to be on? Is this an express lane? Oh no, she said. You're good, I'll take your stuff. Feeling as though I'd won the lottery, I emptied my cart, I filled the black belt. Life is good, isn't it? But no sooner were my items on the belt than the most horrible thing happened. The head cashier pranced over. She told my cashier to turn on the express light. And so the 14 or fewer items light lit up. And I was terrified. So terrified was I started to pray. Please, oh Lord, don't let anyone get behind me. Please don't let anyone from the church see me. Like most of my prayers, that one went unanswered. Almost immediately, 3 other shoppers lined up behind me, all of them with just a couple of items in their little red handheld basket. All of them glaring at me. All of them doing exactly what I would have done had the roles been reversed. They scrutinized my items. I'm certain 2 of them counted. I heard one of them whisper, 29. Then she glared at the sign and then looked at me with rage. Then she muttered something to the shoppers behind her. If looks could kill. To make matters worse, there was an issue with my debit card. I hadn't activated my new debit card on my birthday, but I'd already gotten rid of the old one. I wanted to die. Now, let's go to the gospel. I think this is a story we're all fairly familiar with, the self-absorbed righteous Pharisee and the despised but humble tax collector. And until my grocery store debacle the other day, I don't think I ever really identified with the despised tax collector. Until then, I don't ever remember being the object of scorn, contempt. Thinking about that self-righteous Pharisee, I could almost imagine those shoppers saying, "Thank God I'm not like that jerk with too many items for the express lane." Now I know plenty of people don't like me, but I've never felt contempt. And I also know this little situation of mine in the grocery store may seem trivial and silly, and if that's the worst thing that's happened to me in a long, long time, life is pretty good, isn't it? But it really bothered me. See, I'm a person who believes in law and order, that following the rules is right, that you don't get in the express lane with 15 items. And so this was no small matter, to be judged because I wasn't following the rules. I, who am a literalist when it comes to grocery store etiquette, was horrible. As I thought about that experience, and then I read and lived with the gospel reading it over and over this past week, another thought occurred to me. I wonder what it's like to wake up day after day and week after week knowing that people think you're despicable, deplorable, not good enough. In our story, this tax collector was a Jew who'd been hired by the Romans, an employee of the enemy, the occupying force. He was hired by them to do their dirty work. What kind of self-image do you have when everyone who knows you loathes you? They whisper when they see you coming. That's why you pray like he did from afar. Have mercy on me, an unworthy sinner. But I also realized something else that hit much closer to home. You see, I've been in the shoes of those 3 other shoppers. I've stood in that very line and muttered my disapproval at some thoughtless, rude, ignorant customer with 17 items on the belt. Clear violation of express law, lane law. But until last week, it never even dawned on me that maybe, just maybe, some of those contemptible shoppers with 17 items, maybe what happened to them, what happened to me had happened to them. What if they innocently unloaded their cart, only to be horrified that the head cashier came over and said, "Turn your light on"? So yes, in an honest moment, I know there is a Pharisee that lives in me, that is self-righteous, that is quick to compare myself to others, especially others I look down on, quick to feel smug and self-righteous, quick to stand in judgment at the slightest breach of what's right or expected. Now, this may not be the best parable Jesus ever told, may not be the best sermon you ever heard, but it is the parable with the biggest trap. Because it's awfully darn easy to walk away saying, "Thank God I'm not like the Pharisee. Thank God I'm not like that Graham character." But when we do that, we're doing precisely what the Pharisee did, judging others with contempt. And if I'm honest, I do that too often. I do it when I say, "Thank God I'm not like those Christians who hate homosexuals. Thank God I'm not one of those closed-minded people who reject any form of evolution or despise science. Thank God I'm enlightened and not a Bible-thumping Christian. Thank God I'm not like Donald or Hillary. Thank God I'm not like this person or that person." The judgment game is so easy to be sucked into, so easy to feel morally superior, spiritually better than others. The great Scottish theologian William Barclay tells a wonderful story that I think captures the meaning of the parable, or what Jesus hoped would hit home. It's a story about a judge who was an active member of Barclay's church. That church started a mission church far out in the country, and it was their custom that once a year near Christmas, both churches would come together and worship. And when it came time for communion, this being the Anglican church, the judge found himself kneeling next to a man from the mission church. Nothing strange about that. But this was a person who in his previous life had been a convicted robber, sentenced to prison by that very judge kneeling next to him. A friend of the judge was impressed and after the service said, "Isn't it a miracle what God has done in that man's life, that former robber?" The judge replied, "That may be so, but it's a greater miracle what God has done in my life." His friend was puzzled, and so the judge continued, "I was raised in a loving home. I never went without anything. I had the finest education. I think it's a greater miracle that God get through a person like me and show me that I too stood in need of grace as much as anyone else." That's what the Pharisee couldn't grasp. Nor do we whenever we stand in judgment over others, for all of us need grace. There is something broken in every single person who ever lived. None of us are perfect, and we're more alike each other than we are different. David Brooks. Who knows David Brooks? Well, more of you should. He's a conservative columnist. This is an oxymoron. He's a conservative columnist for the New York Times. He jokes, he tells a wonderful joke. He says that being a conservative writer for the Times is kind of like being the head rabbi in Mecca. But he shares a wonderful story about his travels the last 18 months. In particular, one story that really touched my heart. It's about a story that takes place in Washington, D.C. He says, "I have two friends, David and Kathy, and they had a child who went to public school. And their child had a friend who had no real home. You see, his dad had split and mom had drug and health problems, and so they said to their son, 'Why don't you invite your friend to come over, stay with us? He can live with us. He can eat with us, go to school.' And then that kid had a friend in the same circumstance, and that kid had a friend likewise. And if you go to their house, and I do, Brooks says, every Thursday, and hopefully on Mondays, there's 10, 15, sometimes 25 kids there, 18 to 22 years old, just getting a meal. Last week, a young woman, only 21 years old, came in, and she said this was the first time since she was 11 she sat at a dinner table eating dinner. Brooks says, "I took my daughter there once, and she said, 'This is the warmest house I've ever been in.'" They call all the kids, young adults, they call Kathy and David mom and dad. And there's just warmth and embrace and acceptance. And then Brooks kind of steps back from that story and he makes this observation. During this election season of viciousness and vulgarity and depravity, Thursdays at Kathy and David's has been a weekly uplift, and their home a place to be reminded of what is beautiful about our country and what we can do to bring it out its loveliness. The problems facing our countries are deeper than employment or ISIS. Brooks says it's a crisis of solidarity, a crisis of segmentation, of spiritual degradation and intimacy. And then he comes to a poignant insight, which for me really says it all. Brings it back to the parable. Brooks says this family and these kids, they give us a gift. The gift is of complete intolerance for social distance. A complete intolerance for social distance. There's a huge social distance between the Pharisee and the tax collector. A huge social difference between the left and the right. A huge social distance between ourselves and those we deem different. And that distance needs to dissolve. And that's what good religion does. It has a real disdain for the distance between us. All those things that keep us apart. Good religion brings us together. Religion in the Latin means to bind together. It brings together the left and the right, men and women, young and old, gay and straight, single and married and divorced. And in doing so, it helps us to see the other like we hopefully see ourselves. Each of us with a need to be loved. Each of us with a need to be affirmed and accepted and celebrated. And a need to know that while all of us are far, far from perfect, we are, each and every one of us, more than good enough. Amen.